Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to yet more Warhammer lore. Today we will be talking about Archaon, or Archaon, or Archaon, or Archaon, or Archaon, or a million other pronunciations, because Games Workshop really hates people and likes to make characters with ridiculous names. But for the moment we will simply be calling him Archaon, because I once heard Gav Thorpe speak that name, so I'm going to assume that he knows what he's talking about. Archaon, the Everchosen, has a fairly interesting backstory, which was sadly somewhat ruined by his original introduction into the lore in the Storm of Chaos campaign, which was one of Games Workshop's worst ideas. To sum it up relatively shortly, they decided to launch a campaign involving all of the factions of the Warhammer world and a massive invasion of chaos. They asked Warhammer players to submit their battle results, victories, defeats, draws, etc., into this big old computer system, and based on the results, Games Workshop would build a campaign around it. What Games Workshop failed to realise was that they had just asked one of the most fanatically loyal of communities out there to repeatedly vote for their favourite faction, over and over and over again. I have heard many confessions about people who literally just sat down for about a day and just reported in victories for their favourite faction, and Games Workshop did not have any way of controlling this system, which led to Chaos getting absolutely curb stomps and never even getting off the starting mark, while I think the Greenskins just rampaged across the known world. It wasn't quite the event that Games Workshop had hoped for, and so they decided to basically just fix it by saying that Archaon somehow managed to get all the way south to Middenheim, where he laid siege to the city and engaged in a titanic duel with Sigmar's reborn avatar, the mighty Voltan, champion of all that is just. And after a long and drawn-out vicious duel, Archaon got the better of the champion of the light and wounded him severely. And just before Archaon was about to strike the finishing blow, Grimgor Ironhide tiptoed up behind him and delivered a kick so savage straight to Archaon's groin that he still feels the sting of those iron-tipped boots even to this day, as he wakes up screaming in the night, clutching his privates, his no longer existing family jewels. Tragic. Tragic indeed. And I'm not making this up. You can go read the Storm of Chaos lore for yourself. Grimgor Ironhide really did wander up behind the Lord of the End Times and kick him in the junk. He then proceeded to not kill his defenseless foe, because, orcs have a real sense of fair play, thereby the ambush to the Gibberleys, and wandered off laughing his fucking ass off. While I understand his reaction, I still think I'd planted my axe in the now doubled over Archaon's rear end, but hey. This, as you can imagine, was not quite the ending that Games Workshop was hoping for, and they essentially just scrapped the entire Storm of Chaos campaign and made it non-canon, and then eventually replaced it with the even fucking worse Ender Times, which just literally killed the entire universe. This is downright tragic, because Archaon actually has a pretty good backstory, and now that I've explained to you some of the controversy around his history, I'll actually get into his proper lore. So, Archaon started his life as an imperial servant. In fact, he was a warrior priest. He started his life as a very devoted Sigmarite by the name of Diedrich Kastny, who was born just a few years after the First Great War against Chaos, where Magnus the Pious eventually defeated the forces of darkness around Kislev in a rather apocalyptic confrontation. Unfortunately, war in the Warhammer universe is a rather brutal event, and Diedrich Kastny was born as a result of good old-fashioned rape. His mother was taken rather violently, and definitively against her will, by a northern barbarian, which led little Dietrich to have a rather interesting childhood and pedigree. He wasn't particularly fond of his daddy, because, well, his daddy literally raped Mummy, and abhorred everything the Chaos Gods stood for. Which is an interesting thing, considering he turned out to be their biggest champion, but we'll get to that in a moment. Granted, the writing around why he turned is somewhat sketchy, but again, we'll get to that. You see, there was a prophecy written down in the Liber Callistori, the dreaded book of divination, that was written by Necromundo the Insane, which, as you might be able to judge by his name, was not considered an overly staple individual. In this book, he stated that the North and South would meet in the Everchosen's blood, and, again, Daddy being a Northman and Mummy being a Southerner meant that little Dietrich was indeed the chosen one, selected to bring balance to the Force, the Warhammer universe. Dietrich was eventually taken in by a local Sigmarite priest, and was trained as a Knight Templar of the Order of the Twin-Tailed Orb, a order in which he fought valiantly and faithfully in the service of the God King Sigmar. However, the priesthood neglected to inform Dietrich about the circumstances surrounding his conception, shall we say, and once he inevitably found out, he was just a little bit put off by this particular turn of events, and was thrown into a bit of a crisis of faith. He essentially considered himself a bit of a mutt. He was everything he hated because Daddy once raped Mummy, and for some reason he assumed then that the sins of the father, thereby the sins of the son. It's not the most logical of conclusions, but then again, we are talking about religious zealots here, so you can't expect too much in the way of good old-fashioned logic when it comes to their mental health. And so, there was only really one option, wasn't there? Dietrich needed to find salvation, and the best way to do so, as far as he was concerned, was to head to the centre of his faith, the massive Temple of Sigmar in Altdorf. Presumably, he hoped for some sign, some reassurance that he was not going to be Warhammer's version of Anakin Skywalker. He was, unfortunately, going to be rather disappointed. He knelt down before the massive golden statue of Sigmar and begged for a sign that he was not the Everchosen, that his impure blood was not going to turn out to be a very, very bad thing indeed. However, as some of you might know, talking to a giant statue rarely gives you all that much in the way of answers, and this time as well, the giant inert stone statue decided to not respond to the silly little human that was talking to it. Dietrich took this as a surefire sign that his gods did not exist. Which is a little bit of an interesting subject, because according to the Liber Chaotica, describing how chaos works, Sigmar is almost certainly a god, but he rarely, if ever, speaks. In fact, there are very, 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 very few examples indeed of him having any real effect upon the real corporeal world, be it through signs or words or actions, although he does occasionally decide to possess young peasant boys for reasons I will leave up to your own imagination. However, on this occasion, for one reason or another, Sigmar did not want to talk to Dietrich, a decision that was to have, interestingly enough, both entirely inconsequential consequences and literally world-ending consequences. And this is where shit gets a little bit cray-cray, because, as mentioned, Dietrich now renounced the gods of the South, but also reaffirmed his hatred for his father's old gods, that he then went off to serve, which seems like a bit of an oddity, but apparently he did this to spite fate, by doing the very thing that fate said he was going to do. I don't really know what this means, but If Archaon really wanted to spite fate, he should have just bashed his brains out against the giant statue of Sigma. However, again, for better or worse, he decided that this was not to be his fate. And because of Archaon's pussyfooting and not bashing his face out against a giant block of marble, we are now blessed with the end times. Oh, bloody goody good. Anyways, the now reborn, I suppose I should say, Everchosen decided to head north because, well, if you're seeking the favour of the Chaos Gods, the north is a pretty good place to start. Furthermore, to become the Everchosen of Chaos, one has to complete quite a lot of batshit insane tasks. The first of which was to acquire a unique Mark of Chaos that bore the blessings of all 4 Chaos powers in unison, which is quite the rarity. It combines all the advantages of the individual marks of chaos, be it Khorne, Nurgle, Slaanesh, or Tzeentch, but none of the drawbacks. This being the first part of Archaon's dark quest, you'd figured it was going to be at least somewhat simple, but no, not really. He had to travel to the Dark Elf lands of Nagaroth and offer himself to the gods to gain their favour and recognition. And, as you can probably imagine, offering oneself to the Chaos Gods involves a few trials and tribulations around the way. Knowing this, Archaon gathered himself a, at this point, small Chaos warband which he dubbed the Swords of Chaos. And a good thing too, because the Dark Elves were not particularly fond of his intrusions, doing whatever they could to stop him before he reached a massive dark citadel. This citadel was made of a substance so dark that it was darker even than the heart of a Dark Elf soul. Quite poetic indeed. However, the darkness of the citadel wasn't really the problem. The real problem lie in the citadel's densians, a literal army of very angry, very large, and very teethy monsters that would very much so like to eat Archaon, despite the fact that he was wearing plot armour literally hundreds of inches thick. This allowed Archaon to kill all of these giant monstrosities in the pitch dark after his horse had gotten nom-nommed from underneath him. Eventually, although it was a bit of a workout, Archaon managed to murder all of the angry monsters and offered up their hearts to the Chaos Shrine found within the citadel. This greatly pleased the gods of Chaos, and they bestowed upon him the Mark of Chaos Undivided, which just happened to take the form of a giant-ass burning brand located just between his eyes. Archaon was of course far too much of a badass to be particularly ill-affected by the fact that he now has a piece of burning flesh located right between his rather light sensitive optical nerves, and went off to gather the second piece of the garb of the Everchosen, the armour of Morkar, which was worn by the very first Everchosen of Chaos. It essentially makes the wearer invulnerable to virtually everything except a kick to the cock made by a giant orc warboss, which is its one true flaw. Which, you know, is not the stupidest flaw I've ever heard of. I do seem to remember a certain Greek person whose only weak point was his ankles, so yeah, we'll let this one slide for now. As luck would have it, the armour was located not too far away. Archaon requisitioned a Dark Elf ship pulled by a couple giant-ass sea serpents and ventured off into the sea, where he eventually stumbled upon a funky-ass little continent where neither sun nor moon ever rose. Judging by that description, it is fairly safe to assume that Archaon was no longer in Kansas, Toto, and so he had probably headed into some form of either the Chaos Wastes, or just an area particularly heavily infested with the forces of chaos. The land was populated by large amounts of pale humanoid creatures that Archaon immediately started butchering for no other reason than they were squishy, and eventually he found his way to the tomb of Morkar, in which, of course, the armour was located. Unfortunately, the spirit of Morkar was not particularly fond of this new guy that was about to steal his clothes, and animated the armour through his spirit, forcing it to attack Archaon. Initially, the set of animated armour had the upper hand, raining deadly blows upon Archaon, and since the suit of armour was, well, quite literally invulnerable except to the mighty steel-clad boot of a Blackhawk, Archaon was pushed back until he cursed at the armour, which distracted it and allowed him to just slap it aside. Though, to be fair, he did curse at it in a very special language, a ancient language that the wearer of the suit once used to speak himself, so maybe it distracted him just enough for him to punch him aside, although still, I'd probably wager that just using a "yo mama so fat" joke is probably a fairly bad reason for winning a duel. Nevertheless, Archaon now had a shiny new suit of chaos armour and couldn't be happier. Next up on the demonic shopping list is the Eye of Sheerian, named after the Tzeentchian sorcerer who discovered it, lodged firmly in his buttocks. This wonderful little item, with a slight hint of smell to it, allows the wearer to see the future. However, there is a small catch. It needs to be linked to the crown of domination to truly bring out its full power, and will allow the wielder to not only see the future long terms, but allow them to even see the future pretty much immediately as it happens. Which means, if someone is trying to punch you in the face with a large Warhammer, for example, you'll be able to see them trying to punch you in the face, and take the appropriate actions to move your squishier parts out of the way. A rather handy item, no questions. And joyous occasion, the Eye was only guarded by a single dragon by the name of Flamefang. Now, you might be wondering, isn't that relatively heavily guarded? It's a giant-ass dragon. Yes, but remember that magical piece of fuck-off armour that he just picked up? Well, it's literally impervious to anything except for Grimgor Ironhide. I would like you to once again remember that Grimgor Ironhide put Archaon on his back by kicking him in the groin. With his foot. Just a good old-fashioned kick from behind. The dragon Flamefang doused Archaon in flame, obviously, and then fucking ate him, and this did absolutely nothing. Nothing whatsoever, and he hacked his way out of the beast and took the eye. No one has ever accused Games Workshop of being fans of consistent writing, but this one is probably taking it a tad bit too far. But never mind, moving along. 3 down, 3 to go. And number 4 just happened to be a horse, because of course no self-respecting bringer of the apocalypse would walk into battle. So he had to hunt down the magical horse that goes by the name of Durgar, or Gorshi Ishpak, or Iryantil, or alternatively, just that black horse that Archaon rides. And once again, Archaon proved that he has plot armour thicker than a king tiger, as he simply just wandered into the realms of chaos, snuck into the palace of a demon prince, stole his favourite demonic steed that, by the way, once Archaon jumped onto its back, turned into a pillar of living flame, but he didn't actually give a shit, and just simply slapped it around the head a little bit, and it became obedient. Have I mentioned that Archaon has a tendency to have a little bit more plot armour than most other characters, by the way? However, even Archaon does not have enough plot armour to defeat the person holding the next item he needs on his rather demonic shopping list, the Chaos Blade, Slayer of Kings. The sword created by the second Everchosen by binding the greater demon Uzul into the blade. Now, as you might imagine, being bound inside of a knife for millennia can get a little bit boring, and so the greater demon was a wee bit pissed at this point in time, but Archaon did not know any of this yet. He knew roughly where the blade was, at the top of the Chimera Plateau, deep within the Chaos Wastes, guarded by armies of, well, chimeras. Again, those Swords of Chaos followers turned out to be quite handy, as Archaon and his followers fairly swiftly cleared the plateau of its bestial guardians. There was, however, one slight problem, namely the fact that once Archaon climbed the mountain with his 3 favoured champions, he suddenly realised the mountain was moving. Turned out that the mountain that they were climbing was not a mountain at all, but Kraken Rock the Black, the father of the Dragon Ogres, a Shoggoth literally the size of a mountain range. Even Archaon does not have enough plot armour to kill this thing, so he decided to simply just steal the sword instead, because Kraken Rock is sleeping as he has been for a very long time indeed. However, being the size of a mountain and clutching somehow the sword Slayer of Kings in his massive fist, it became a little bit more complicated. One of Archaon's strongest followers just barely managed to raise one of Kraken Rock's gargantuan fingers far enough for Archaon to retrieve the blade. Unfortunately, the sword was not particularly cooperative and started screaming like a banshee, which, for some reason, they figured might actually wake the Dragon Ogre, despite the fact that an entire battle literally fought around his ears did do precisely dick to his sleeping form, but hey, once again, consistent writing and all that. So, nervous of waking up this hill-sized monstrosity, Archaon simply just plunges the sword into the chest of his followers, quenching the sword's thirst for blood, and also making sure that everyone knows he's a bit of a cunt in the bargain. However, it should be remembered that being a bit of a cunt is a badge of honour for any true Chaos Warlord. I mean, remember Sigwald? That's a bastard who will stab you in the face if he thinks you might potentially be prettier than him, or if he thinks you're not pretty enough, which is a rather dodgy position for anyone to take. So, again, there's really no shortage of followers. As long as you can prove to be the centre of the gods' attention, people will flock around you in the hopes of just getting a little bit of that attention for themselves, regardless of how absolutely beyond psychotic said leader might turn out to be. And Archaon was a very popular leader at this point in time, as now he only needed one more item to become the next Everchosen, and that was the Crown of Domination, the crown that once held the ire of Sheerian. Unfortunately for Archaon, nobody knew where the damn thing was, and it took him decades after retrieving the Slayers of Kings to actually figure out why. And even then, he didn't actually find it out himself, but the demon Be'lakor revealed its location to him, planning to steal it, because, well, he's a demon, and they're all traitorous little bastards. The Crown of Domination lay within the first shrine created in the name of the Chaos Gods, at the top of one of the many mountain peaks in the World's Edge Mountains, which Archaon climbed quite handily on the back of his magical steed that can climb up sheer rock faces because, well, demon horse. He was tested quite severely by the various Chaos Gods to see if he was truly worthy of becoming their next champion, as the very first Temple to Chaos was at this point essentially a part of the Chaotic Realms, which allowed them to do all kinds of crazy shit. For example, Nurgle sent many different variants of herpes to try and lay the great Everchosen low, but he fought off these diseases with willpower alone. Khorne sent a greater demon, which he simply just bitch-slapped out of the way with no real effort. Sinesh sent an army of sexy bitches, which he just simply ignored, because at this point he had been riding a flaming, spiky horse for decades. You can imagine what that would do to the plumbing. And lastly, Tzeentch sent him into a labyrinth of mirrors. Instead of, touching one wall of the labyrinth and then simply following that to the end, which would be the sensible and simple thing to do, Archaon blindfolded himself and then presumably just walked through the mirrors in a straight line till the exit. Having defeated these, in all due honesty, pathetic challenges, he finally found the Crown of Domination, placed upon the withered brow of an ancient corpse. Not giving much of a shit of grave robbery, seeing as he'd already pulled off some far more ridiculous stuff, Archaon simply just took the crown and began arranging his coronation, where the demon Belakor, having forgotten all about stealing the crown at this point, carried out the final ceremony that saw Archaon finally become the tool of chaos he was always meant to be, extinguishing the last of his humanity. I do like how his lore is written here, saying that he finally embraced the destiny that lay before him. Which I find amusing, because he clearly wasn't resisting said destiny particularly well, seeing as he'd been searching for that specific destiny for about 100 years at this point, but again, consistent writing and all that nonsense. And the rest, as they say, was shit. History, I mean. Specifically, the end times. And, as you should all be very, very well aware of at this point, I consider that to be one of the steamier piles of horseshit to have ever been produced in the Games Workshop offices. And heavens knows they've shat on plenty of thing before this, so the fact that this pile stands out as particularly putrid is quite the bloody achievement. As such, I will be ending the lore video on Archaon there. If you do wish to read a little bit further about him, however, well, I would suggest popping over to the Warhammer wiki, which continues his tale into the end times, in which his plot armour grows ever thicker. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.